In India, in Madras, there was music making for 24 hours in the street. A piano consists of a large number of steel strings stretched on a steel frame. They are excited by being struck with hammers. The hammers are connected to keys, forming a keyboard. Depressing a key actuates the hammer, which in turn strikes the string. There are 3 plain steel strings for each note, and the 5 upper octaves, 2 wrapped strings for each note from the second B to the G below.
It was commissioned by Radio New Zealand in 1978. So I'd been back in New Zealand only a few years. I was still somebody they wanted to have as one of the up-and-coming people who are, going to give them lots of things in the future. They wanted to make sure that they consolidated what I was doing, where I was, what I was doing, and they wanted to give me something to play as well. They wanted me to do a lot of performance for them. Radio New Zealand in those days was marvellous. There was a petition in Parliament a week ago which got 5,000 signatures asking for more money for Radio New Zealand. And they said, come and demonstrate on this day when we hand it over on the steps of Parliament. Roger and I went to this demonstration, partly because we had been part of the first demonstration when Radio New Zealand started falling to pieces, and they pulled down Broadcasting House and left 3 rubbishy bits of fecal art material there. Just disgusting stuff what they did in that wee part. And it was meant to be for another building, and they needed the room to put a building. They never put a building there. They just wanted to get rid of Broadcasting House, and it was the most awful thing that the government did. And they kept on doing awful things to radio. And we got a committee going, and really we created demonstrations at that time. And then recently, just this week ago, there was this affair on the steps of Parliament where they passed over these 500 signatures saying, give more money to Radio New Zealand. Who do their level best to be interesting. And, one of the lifelines in the country, of people who can talk with real understanding of what's going on in the world. There's so much that they do. So we went along and demonstrated, but it was the day of that huge storm. And it was just pelting down. It was terrible weather. It was cold, it was miserable. And we got closer and closer, and we said, I don't see it anywhere. Where are all the people? Where are the people? And the rain just stopped as we got there. And we saw somebody standing by one of the statues writing something, and she had a megaphone. So we went and said, you've got a megaphone. Okay, tell us where this demonstration is. And she looked around all forlorn. And she said, it's here. And there was nobody else there. We were the only people there. And then 2 MPs came out of the building, and they were given the signatures, and there was a speech given, and it was given to Roger and me because we were the only people in the audience. It was a very good speech, and it should be given again. And it took 5 minutes. So this was very strange. So that story is because Radio New Zealand in this time was really good. This was 1978. They still had enormous worth. They did really, really good things. And they had this international music day that was all over the world. The equivalent organisations got together to make prizes and to have days when music from all around the world was played all around the world. Isn't this international stuff? And they asked me to provide the New Zealand entry. And that was just really nice to have that commission. It was a really good commission. And they gave me free rein as to what instruments I had, and said it couldn't be more than 24 instruments. So I said it won't be. And they were intrigued when I said that I wanted 3 trumpets and 2 grand pianos and 3 singers, three sopranos and a narrator. And what are you going to do with them? I said, oh, wait and see. So I wanted the 3 sopranos on one side and the 3 trumpets on the other side, and I wanted them to, sort of splat at each other. Okay, so that you had triadic harmony here and triadic harmony here, and they were in different keys and very simple ideas. Because it had to be simple, because it had to be something which they could do with, like they would have just a couple of microphones. They were still in those days. You did things with one microphone, and they wanted something which would express something of New Zealand's mentality and show something of New Zealand's place in the world. And so it was a simple country still. It's no longer nearly as simple as it was. And at the same time, I wanted it to express something that was going on in my life. Obviously, we had the 2 grand pianos, and so that was part of it, that we had this kind of spatial aspect to it, that it had these sort of, a complex of sopranos, a complex of trumpets, a complex of piano, and then people with words, because words were always really, really important to me, and so it had to be a conglomeration of words for all the countries that was going around, all the different kinds of verbal things that were going to be going on, talking about this big day. At the same time in my life, what was going on was that my father had just died, and he had written a whole lot of poems, and I took some of his poems to be the centre of this piece. And so You Can't Kiss the Tummy of Caged Lion, that was the title of one of his pieces, and it was actually about a couple who were having marriage guidance counselling. Now this sounds weird, but my father was a marriage guidance counsellor, and he did it by writing poems about the mess that these 2 people in front of him had got themselves into, and giving them in poetry clues to how to make a better life and how they could get back together again and how things were. And he had enormous success in getting people together, because they had to go through these very convoluted poems, and he was a very, very kind of convoluted kind of brain. He was very academic in some ways, and very, very complex thoughts. And so he made complex poems. And you had to think about your life in terms of what he put in the poem, and because you then had to, or they had to think about what was happening to the people in the poem, or where the poem was going, they spent so much time together that somehow they stayed together. I mean, those were terrifically successful times for him. So none of that was important to this piece, but that's why The Caged Lion, and You Can't Kiss the Tummy of the Caged Lion, because that was my father's view on a particularly difficult situation that people had found themselves in. But me, I just loved those ideas, and I used the phrases as a refrain going through the piece. You can't kiss the tummy of a caged lion.
For there to be a moment or two of silence. French musique, and Latin musica, and the Greek, literally the art of the muses.
One of sister goddesses, the offspring of Zeus and Nemesis, memory, regarded as the inspirers of learning and the arts, especially of poetry and music, and represented as young and beautiful virgins.
In modern use, Clio is the muse of history, Talia of comedy and Melpomene of tragedy, Utopia of music, Terpsichore of dancing, and Urania of astronomy. The other names, Erato, Polyhymnia, and Calliope, are not so often heard.
So that was at the background. The words were there because the words were interesting, not because of the marriage guidance counselling background, which nobody needed to know. And then I knew that I wanted to have something New Zealand, and I was looking through all sorts of things, which what would mark New Zealand in the eyes and ears of other people. And a sort of Captain Cook, there were these journals of his 3 voyages. And I went through those looking for instances of things that he'd said. And then I was looking at other Captain Cook material and accounts of his death and various of the different events in various places in New Zealand over those 3 journeys, and used some of the accounts of these aspects, and one of them was about his death, and there's a sort of a section which is shouted by the narrator about how they got a rock and bashed his head, and he'd fallen into the sea, and then he was seen no more, and I just sort of wonder if this was like a prophecy that Radio New Zealand was to be seen no more, and that it's being bashed in the head by television, stupid politicians, whoever it is, who have made Radio New Zealand get less and less worth. So that was the Captain Cook things, but there were a lot of things which I found which are narrated or which are sung, which had various connections either to the piece or to New Zealand at the time. The silliest one was the quotations from the letter from Radio New Zealand asking me to do this, the actual commission itself, and there are various phrases throughout. Dear Miss Bibby, dear Miss Bibby, we would like, dear Miss Bibby, we would like you to, and so on, and never quite getting to the point. Because the piece is all never quite getting to the point, but building and releasing and building and releasing, and the battering of the trumpets and the screaming of the sopranos and the yelling of the narrator and this great battery of percussion, which is very joyous in some ways and triumphant in some ways and exciting, and the whole thing was just to be a glorious conglomeration of interesting sounds and voices and ideas, specifically for radio. When it was done, I don't think that the Radio New Zealand people had any idea what I was getting at, and probably nobody else did either, but it certainly made very good radio. And it was sent away overseas and was played all around the world for New Zealand's entry into the first International Music Day, and also won a prize.
This is determined by the jack and jack regulator. While the key is depressed, the damping pad does not engage the strings. In general, the blow of the hammer lasts for a time comparable to the period of the string. The struck point moves in advance of more remote parts of the string. Under the above conditions of excitation, it can be shown that it is possible to suppress certain harmonics, depending upon the striking point of the string. For example, the 7th and higher harmonics will be suppressed if the string is struck at a point 1/7 of the length from the air.